Well, therefore, today we are going to talk about pure and hard dietetics. We already know this. We are going to talk about the act of eating, about everything that happens before the nutrient, before the food enters the mouth, all that decision-making of the patient, how it needs to be focused for it to be successful. We are going to talk about nutritional coaching, for example, at the end of the day, because I believe it is the most pleasant thing to finish today. After the whole weekend, we are going to talk about motivation and we are going to talk about clinical tests. Therefore, we are going to see how we can approach the patient so that the choice of those foods, which is a completely voluntary act, and as we know, is very emotional and has many cultural, social, and familial connotations. And if we don't address that, then the diet will usually be a failure. No matter how well we focus on nutrients, on having a completely balanced diet, as Marta mentioned yesterday, if we don't address this more sociocultural and anthropological aspect, it will be a guaranteed failure. However, nourishing oneself is an involuntary act, which is what you were talking about yesterday. When we talk about, I studied the degree in human nutrition and dietetics, it is nutrition, knowing what happens inside the body, how we are going to absorb those nutrients and how they are going to nourish us. And dietetics is the part of diet formulation. Yesterday at the end, you also covered dietetics because you talked about food combinations. You also discussed menus, how to mix some things with others. Dietetics, therefore, is the discipline that will study the dietary regimen and its nutritional implications. The word diet is a word that I don't like at all, but because of the negative connotations it usually carries, when the patient thinks I'm going to go on a diet, they are already thinking about restrictions, about what they are going to take away from me, about how much they are going to limit what I have to eat. However, it should be approached as something positive. The word diet actually comes from the Latin word dieta and means what I eat in 24 hours in a day. That is the word diet, and it should not carry other types of connotations. And we nutritionists have the task of making that diet not something negative, but something positive for the patient. And we are talking here about integrative nutrition or integrative dietetics. What does that mean? In contrast to the approach that is sometimes taken in dietetics, well, it means that we are going to take the person into account in their entirety, considering body, mind, and environment, as we will discuss right now. And then we will have a broad cultural and anthropological perspective in the text that I provided for you to read before coming here. Things related to nutrition and the anthropology of food have been included. When I finished my degree, my mentor, Dr. Jose Francisco Quinao, with whom I have been for many years, who is the medical director of the clinic, one of the first things he told me was, you need to start reading about anthropology. He gave me the book by Jesus Contreras called Anthropology of Food, and he said, you need to broaden your perspective on nutrition, because I had studied at Complutense. I came with my pattern of balanced eating, of pure and strict Mediterranean diet, and then starting to read and exploring about what is eaten in various different parts of the world in other societies, and how that food ultimately influences health in a positive or negative way, which is often not taught in the degree. Because they talk to us about epidemiology, but we really don't delve much into learning about other patterns that, although they may not be present in our current environment, will greatly broaden our nutritional perspective. So one of the things I also wanted to encourage you to do is to read about anthropology, because it is very beautiful and helps us understand a bit how we have evolved, how eating has affected us in one way or another, and why now patterns that we recently talked about as an aberration. When they talked to me about fasting, about skipping meals in the degree, I said it can't be. Or when they talked to me about removing dairy from a patient, I said impossible. It's the main source of calcium. So, when you start to read and study a bit about anthropology or evolutionary medicine, which we are going to talk about, you realize that patterns that may not currently be in our environment or that we are not used to having will be successful when it comes to addressing treatment in the patient. What happens with nutritional epidemiology? Many times, always, when talking about nutrition, especially in the medical approach, in more conventional medicine, it is often said that it is not sufficiently proven. When you say, no, this diet is good for this pathology, well, there is not much evidence behind behind the idea that nutrition is so important. Why is that? Really, because unless we go to epidemiological studies, diet is something global and so different for each person, and so many factors come into play when addressing how a person eats in a clinical study. It is very difficult to see to what extent a nutritional pattern has helped that person improve their health. It is extremely complicated, because diet is ultimately continuous exposure to many nutrients throughout the day over the course of weeks. So how do we define that pattern? It is easy to study how a nutrient can affect a specific biochemistry, but a diet, therefore. The most interesting thing is always to look at more epidemiological studies. But in the end, we have to rely a lot on clinical experience. They can tell me that it is not sufficiently proven that dairy casein, for example, which I mentioned earlier about dairy, is inflammatory. But in clinical practice, removing dairy casein from a person who has digestive issues, or a person who has a lot of mucus, or a person who has allergies leads to reduced inflammation. So you say, I see it in clinical practice every day, as you all will, but sometimes it is still not sufficiently proven. That is also where we need to start publishing and coming together so that this becomes more evident every day. We always talk about the clinical case, how important it is. And here I bring you to talk a little about epidemiology and very different nutritional patterns, some curiosities such as this study, or rather this that was published by National Geographic. And it talked about the areas, what it called the blue zones, which are areas in the world where there is a lower prevalence of diseases, where there is more longevity. And what was studied were the dietary patterns, how they influenced these areas of the world. Of course, it is not just about food. As we have said, nutrition is accompanied by a lifestyle. So in general, these are areas, as I put below, they are areas where people lead a calm life, where they interact. Areas where they have a more relaxed life, less stress, where they have a great emotional stability. But Italy, for example, is one such area. All of them are areas where they also follow quite vegetarian diets, rich in vegetables, which we know is ultimately a fundamental basis, as you mentioned yesterday, for having a high amount of vitamins and antioxidants in our diet. Well, Sardinia, which follows a Mediterranean diet, but above all prioritizes the consumption of vegetables, fish, nuts, and olive oil, that Mediterranean diet we talk about so much, but which in reality today, for example, in Spain, we are quite far from. The island of Okinawa, where the longest lived women in the world also live, has 5 times less lung cancer and 6 times fewer cardiovascular diseases. They are areas of the world where people follow very healthy eating patterns, in addition to an active life and an overall healthy lifestyle with little stress. In California, the Seventh-day Adventists, who are also vegetarians, and in the Nicoya Peninsula, where they eat a lot of fruits and cereals rich in antioxidants. As I was saying, we need to go to these areas to see a bit of what they are eating and how we should then apply that in our environment. The PREDIMED study, Manda, is also a very interesting study. It is one of the studies that is being conducted. It is still ongoing. It started in 2003 and is one of the largest studies being done on the Mediterranean diet. Here, they are studying how to incorporate healthy fats like olive oil and walnuts into our diet. These types of fats will help improve cardiovascular health. This is a study that is really very interesting and continues to evolve. And it has been in development for many years. And as you can see here, another interesting thing that I wanted to show you is the nutritional pyramid, how it is changing. I suppose you also studied that nutritional pyramid where cereals were at the base of our diet, and this is already changing nowadays. Right now, we place, well, the foundation of physical activity, which is super important, and hydration, okay, but there is another pyramid where hydration is also placed at the base, right? Not in this one. But above all the vegetables that are so important come into play and really have to be the foundation of our diet. The initial pyramid that had everything, cereals at the base, which is the one we know and which mentioned that one should consume 50-60% carbohydrates, mainly from flours and grains, was created by the United States Department of Agriculture. And we really see that it has little to do with what we are discussing now, not about how The excess of carbohydrates in the world we live in and with the lifestyle we lead, which is very sedentary, is certainly not doing us any good. And then fish is the next base of the pyramid, and at the top, as we see, are meat and saturated fats, although there is also much controversy about this, and we will talk about how this is changing, and depending on the patient we have in front of us, the lifestyle they lead, well, their eating pattern does not have to be exactly focused on a nutritional pyramid that, of course, does not personalize anything at all, but is very general. Although, well, it is good that these pyramids exist, because in the end, it is a way to educate the population on how we should eat. And then I also mentioned that you should read, well, I shared a video, the book, The Obese Monkey, which is very interesting about Darwinian medicine, because it is also good, apart from what I have said about epidemiology or the anthropology of food, to study how we have evolved as living beings, as humans, and how nutrition has been decisive in being who we are and having a certain genetics. Today we are going to talk about genetic studies. It is important to conduct them, and we are increasingly doing more genetic studies to greatly personalize the patient's nutrition, but we really have a genetics that has not evolved as quickly as we have evolved as living beings and as our environment has evolved. And in the end, we possess, and we see this in genetic studies, we are going to look at one type besides obesity, although there are many studies that can be done that are not about obesity, but of another type, for example, of antioxidant capacity, of how our liver detoxifies. But we are going to look at one about obesity, and we see that obese people have that thrifty genetics of our ancestors. We come from a living being that did not have food to eat at all times, as we do now, because he ate. When he could hunt, the Paleolithic man, that man who had to hunt the animal to eat, had a very high metabolic expenditure, and when he ate a lot, because then he had to generate reserves for the rest of the time until he could eat again. So in the end, that thrifty genotype, that insulin resistance, which at the time was an advantage, because what helped us is that the brain, which is very demanding of glucose, when there was no glucose, had enough energy. Nowadays, we are eating constantly. We eat 5 or 6 times a day, and also with that diet that has been taught to us, so rich in carbohydrates. In the end, we generate with that thrifty phenotype or genotype, what we are generating is metabolic syndrome and obesity, because we have this genetics of our ancestors who had to adapt to an environment where they did not have so many fruits and so much sugar to eat at all times. So we have to be aware that this genetics is there. We need to study it in patients, and in this way approach their nutrition differently. It is clear that we live where we live. We cannot change the environment we have, but we must be aware that it is not a favorable environment for that genetics, for that body we have, and we need to adapt it to that. Therefore, this is a bit of an introduction to things I want you to... Now, we cannot talk about all those epidemiological studies that exist, nor about the approach of the monovis, for example, but, well, it is something that I do want you to read and take an interest in when you leave here, which I suppose you already have, because it is very interesting for when we have a patient in front of us and we are going to conduct a nutritional study like the one we are going to do now. We must be aware that the act of eating is an act that is biological, nutritional, medical, but also social, psychological, economic, and symbolic. We are omnivorous human beings, and we need to eat a lot of variety, and we have to teach our patients to eat a lot of variety because we have the conditioning of that variety. For example, if a patient who is vegan or vegetarian comes to your consultation, of course you have to help them eat well. You will approach it correctly, but it is a philosophy of life, and it can have certain deficiencies because our body needs our diet to be very varied, and that we consume animals and that we consume vegetables. So in this regard, there can sometimes be a lot of controversies, but it remains a philosophy of life. And we should never get caught in that dietary funnel that exists when we eat just 4 things. Think about your day-to-day life in a week, how many different foods you can consume. How many could you consume just like that? How many do you think in a week, in 7 days, how many types of foods can you consume? Tell me a number. 40. Well, it's not bad. 20. also over there, right? These questions need to be asked to the patients because sometimes we think, well, I do too, that we eat a variety, that we eat a lot, that our diet is very balanced. But then it's true that you think about what you're eating throughout the day. Well, 40 is many foods, that's very good, but we are caught in a funnel where we eat 4 things, where we don't achieve that variety, and that's what we've sometimes been taught when we think about. In these diets, you have to take so many grams of carbohydrates. I don't know, for example, you eat 100 grams of carbohydrates at lunch, but a menu is not given to the patient, and it is not said that this carbohydrate today has to come from rice. Tomorrow it can come from quinoa. The day after tomorrow it can come from potatoes. Another day it can come from millet. They are not taught to eat that variety. In the end, the patient, there are diets like that are a little sheet where it says 100 grams of this, 200 of that, another. The patient is going to eat the same thing every day. And it is thought that they will have the same nutrients simply because they have the carbohydrates that the nutritionist has prescribed. So, we need to embrace that variety and teach how to eat. It is very important that with patients, we not only focus on what is bad, what they should stop eating. You shouldn't eat sugar, you shouldn't eat saturated fats, you shouldn't eat, but rather teach them what they should start eating and let the removal take a back seat. Something that is explained at the beginning, which we often already know, but then in the consultation we have to focus on what we are going to eat, on all that variety so that we don't get caught in that food funnel. And as I said, ask them a bit about their diet and the amount of foods they know and consume regularly. And then we cannot forget the cultural aspect of food, because not everything that is nutritious is considered food in all parts of the world. This is also interesting, but insects, for example, which are now being incorporated here in the West, as a very nutritious food, and that will also help us consume less meat, for example, which ultimately the cost. Regarding meat consumption, the environmental cost is very, very high, and what it means at an environmental level, well, insects, for example, are a very high-quality protein and also provide us with polyunsaturated fats, omega-3, but of course, we say this right now here, and it is extremely difficult for us to start eating insects. It is like that, but, well, now they are selling it to us as protein bars or these energy bars, and it seems that this way we are more open to it, but when they tell us that they are made from insects, well, we really don't like them much. But in other parts of the world, however, such as Latin America or Asia, insects are edible and they like them. Telling us right now to eat a dog here is crazy, and yet in other parts of the world it is, and this will influence each person's food choices. Another thing in a good nutritional history, which we will get to now, is that we need to ask the patient about all these aspects, because choosing one food over another will depend not only on what we like or dislike and what we know it will provide us, but also on the accessibility of that food. We have to help the patient find the food, because if I tell them to eat seaweed and they have no idea where to find it and they go crazy looking for seaweed for several days to get to it, in the end, they are not going to consume it. And that will mean another failure. The state of health. We are now going to talk a lot about food intolerance or tolerance, about the microbiota, about how the patient will reject a food based on how they tolerate it. Patients often come to you asking for a study on food intolerances. I have that every day. Elisa, please do a food intolerance study for me because I'm already desperate. I no longer know what I tolerate well and what I tolerate poorly. We need to explain to them what that tolerance depends on and how it can be worked on to ensure that the tolerance is good. But logically, if I tell you to have a salad with tomato today and you don't tolerate tomato because it gives you acidity, then logically you are not going to eat it. Socioeconomic factors as well, to interpret or know to what extent you can incorporate certain foods or others. I love all these superfoods that provide many nutrients, but there are patients who cannot go for them because in the end it represents a very high expense and we need to start with more basic things. Superfoods are really all those that provide us with many nutrients. So a tomato can be considered a superfood because it also has many antioxidants, apart from an acai berry. And this also needs to be communicated to the patient so that they can have variety and not just feel frustrated because we are suggesting foods that are very difficult to access. And on a cultural and religious level. We increasingly have more cultures living together, and we need to know that if a person does not eat pork for cultural reasons, then logically it should be removed. And then the choice of foods nowadays is very, 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 very conditioned by media influence. And another thing is that anyone who has an Instagram account and follows 5 or 6 nutritionists comes to the consultation today with a confusion about whether fasting is good, whether fasting is bad, whether to eat carbohydrates, whether to follow the paleo diet, or whether to follow a vegetarian diet. I have read a book that strongly reinforces the idea of becoming vegan, and then another that tells me no, that I have to eat everything that the Paleolithic man ate. In reality, there is no single diet that works for everyone. In these books, there is often a lot of generalization, and yet we need to see who is in front of us. Once a patient came to me who was following a Paleolithic diet and initially was a very athletic triathlete. At first I said, you need to eat carbohydrates and especially sources of cereals so that you have a quick carbohydrate to help you in your physical activity, which is what she was looking for me to help improve her performance. But of course, her lab results were perfect. She had been following this diet for a long time. He was a man. To give you an idea of what kind of man he was, a man who ran barefoot. I mean, he couldn't be more paleo. In other words, a person who had logically studied his pattern a lot, who ate a lot of fruit to provide the carbohydrates he needed, a lot of fat. He did some fasting that had helped him improve that metabolic flexibility. I asked this patient, why would I introduce rice to you if you don't need it? I am going to learn a lot from you because your diet is really helping you evolve and achieve optimal performance. So in that patient, why would I take him out of that diet? But I propose this diet to another person. And logically, it doesn't work for him because he doesn't have that metabolic flexibility. He hasn't trained it. So, as I say, in the end, we are going to be conditioned by many things. Nowadays, there is no culinary culture. We have lost a lot of the learned pattern from my mother or family in terms of food, or there is one, but it is very conditioned by a more social environment. We have lost the way we eat. Unitary, across the whole family, also because nowadays the pattern of that mother or father, it doesn't matter, that person at home who educates their children about food is not as established. Speed and simplicity of cooking take priority. Another very important thing is to give them easy, quick ideas that are simple. Because if they don't have time to cook, why would I ask them to cook? Something they won't do. There is the culture of fast food. There is healthy fast food. We can also educate them to make simple things but balance them well. There is accessibility to all kinds of foods, and that also makes it so that sometimes we have much more confusion, not knowing which way to go. The quantity and price take precedence over the quality of what we eat. I go shopping, and the first thing I do is look at the offers available to decide what I am going to eat. And today, we are not going to talk about that. I don't know if you talked to Marta about labeling yesterday. No, right? Okay. Well, today we are not going to delve into labeling either, but it is another very interesting part, knowing how to read a label and teaching our patients that when they go shopping, in addition to us, guiding them a bit on products they should consume. They need to read the labeling, they need to read the ingredients, not just the nutritional information. It is important to see how much sugar a food may contain, but we also need to know where that source of sugars comes from. If you are consuming something that contains raisins, it will have more sugar, but if the source is natural and at that moment you want to have raisins, for example, because you are going to exercise, then that's fine. However, if it is sugar that has been added, then that is what we are not interested in. Or where the fat comes from. It has a lot of fat. Well, if it is a food that contains nuts or olive oil, then it might be good for it to have more fat. Now there are these applications. You may know Yuka, for example, which is an app that reads labels. Well, this app does a good job of showing the content in terms of additives because it tells you which additives are better and worse, but for example, it does not take these things into account. It indicates that olive oil is not that good because it has a lot of fat. Of course, it is olive oil. It is a source of fat, of course, but it is good. So, be careful with that kind of thing. And as I was saying, the food system, the way of eating has changed a lot. No. In the book I mentioned by Contreras, they talk about the individualization of the food system, how it has become decentralized. That is to say, right now people no longer sit. Well, in Spain we still maintain that, but many times. We do not sit down to have a family meal at fixed times, but rather we snack constantly. Patients need to be educated to have schedules, to have order, not to eat without knowing what time they are eating. We also need to address the issue of schedules and disembedding. People no longer eat as much with family. Everyone eats at different times, which also means we have lost a lot of a dietary pattern. Desynchronization, dinner is done whenever. Whenever one wants. There is a total lack of schedules in families. All of this means there is no order. We do not eat in an organized manner. And where do we eat? We need to tell our patients to try to eat at the table. Why? Because they will eat better, they will chew more, they will enjoy, they will experience the moment as a nutritious experience. Not like when I'm watching TV and eating and not realizing what I'm eating, not making the act of eating conscious. What they now call mindful eating is very important. What am I eating? Why am I eating it? That we chew the food well. This is part of nutrition. This is fundamental so that when I eat that food, it is well digested. If I don't chew, eat quickly, and am not aware of what I'm eating, then logically I am likely hindering the nutritional process for my digestive system.